Hey, it's Todd with In Gear Garage. Today we're finishing up our LS1 so we can get it ready to swap into our 3-door Suburban. All we're going to be doing today is installing our starter, which doesn't sound all that difficult, and it's not. A couple wires and a couple bolts. But there are some steps and measurements you need to take to ensure the longevity of your starter and its cranking performance. Now, PowerMAX introduced the PowerMAX Plus line of starters as a very affordable, high-performance mini starter. They're starting with a permanent magnet Hitachi motor, and then they kind of hot rod it. They add a steel gear insert, which is good for carbureted engines and survives a little bit better during backfires and stuff than the plastic one originally. Plus it comes with this billet mounting block, and on this model it has 12 different locations, so you can clock the motor assembly around to clear exhaust, oil pan kickouts, or even suspension issues. So let's go ahead and get this thing mounted and see what we got to do to measure and get everything looking good. Now the first thing you want to do with any block mounted starter is make sure you have a super clean surface area. Clean of grime and paint and stuff, because this is actually the ground for the starter, and there's a lot of current going across there. And speaking of that, on the bolts, PowerMaster always supplies nice new hardware with its block mounted starters. Use them. These have little knurls down on the end of them, and that helps keep everything square and secure when the starter's engaged every time. So be sure to use the bolts. These bolts on your final installation need to be tightened to about 30-35 foot-pounds of torque, but for now we're going to get them pretty darn snug and start doing some checking. Now the first measurement you're going to want to take is just make sure you have about a 1/16 of an inch between the ring gear and the pinion gear. And always check in a couple different places by spinning the engine over. Probably 3 to 4 different places. With the starter mounted, there's a couple more measurements that you need to take. Now we're lucky that we're standing above the engine getting to do this, but these are all things that you can do when you're underneath or laying on your back replacing your starter. It's important to check these out. So what you need to do is pull the pinion gear out to where it engages with the ring gear. And then what you're going to check is the gear mesh. This is where the teeth come together on that. And you're going to need 20 to 35 thousandths. How do you measure that? Well, it's lucky that a standard paper clip is about 30-35 thousandths. So once you pull the pinion gear out, get your paper clip straightened out a little bit and measure where the ring gear tooth goes into the pinion gear. And we're right on. We got plenty of clearance in this setup for us. Now if the gear mesh is a little tight, that's where these little shims come into play. You take the starter motor off, put one of these between the engine block and the starter mounting block, tighten it down and check it again. You should get a little bit more clearance. And PowerMaster always supplies a couple of these shims with their starters. Now the last thing you want to check before you button up your starter installation is the engagement of the pinion gear going into the flex plate. Kind of the pinion gear depth into the ring gear. And then again, once you had your pinion gear pulled out, just take a look and see. You're going to want about 1/2 to 2/3 of the way into the pinion gear. And another thing is always check this in 3 or 4 spots on the flex plate. So spin it around and make multiple checks. Now if you had an excessive amount of gear engagement, you're going to need to install this little shim behind this block. Easy to do. There's simply just 3 hex heads that hold the starter on, or that hold the mounting block onto the starter. And also be sure to make an engagement mark so you know where this thing goes back on. It'll save you time. I almost guarantee that you can put it on in the wrong place and not know it. But these 3 bolts come out. Obviously I loosened them a little bit before. And then the block just pops right off. And there you go. Now, shim's just simply going to go into place between the starter motor and the block, which brings the gear back a little bit. In this application, it's going to be a little easier to install this onto the mounting block to keep the screws all lined up. There we go. With the shim in there, line up our marks. Make sure everything's positioned and tighten the bolts back down. Well, there you go. Those are just a couple of the simple measurements you should take to ensure the longevity and cranking performance of your starter. Now one last thing, when you're moving to a high torque starter, inspect your cable, your battery cable that comes down to the starter, because these draw a lot of current and a lot of torque, especially with a high performance engine. Make sure you might need to replace that with a heavy duty multi-strand wire. PowerMaster can help you out on that too. In fact, if you have any more questions, PowerMasterPerformance.com, or give them a call. They love to talk to you and find out how they can help you. Thanks for watching.